Hello, everybody. Welcome to the inaugural, comprehensive yet informal study of. Right now, it's the Encyclopaedia Logic, but hopefully, I won't eat these words later. But the start of the comprehensive yet informal Encyclopedia Sciences study that Hegel wrote. This is the outline of the Hegelian system of philosophy, of his absolute idealism. So big stuff here. I was gonna initially wait till we finished Kant study, which you might be here from Kant study. We also do a Marx study on this channel of Marx's Capital. We're also looking to do all three volumes. We're on volume one at the beginning right now. I believe we're starting chapter three. So we've got a lots of ways to go. We're furthest in Kant study. We're in the transcendental logic. So and now we're starting Hegel study, the Encyclopedia study. Hopefully, after this, we'll also do science of logic. But knowing the pace of how these have been going, it'll probably take us years to get there. So we'll see where we're at when we get there. But this is the Encyclopedia Sciences. It starts with logic. It's the outline of a system. This three-part system, which is comprises of logic, nature, and Geist. Um, so logic has to do with thought, at least in Hegel. Don't think of like contemporary like first order logic or anything. This is different. Although it'll engage in similar subjects, it's a broader project. Has to do with just general thought, and thought is something that we will just talk about in this. So keep hold on a definition for that. Um, but this is exciting. This is big. Uh, uh, this is my favorite philosophy. Based, I've not read the entirety of this work, but I've read a bit of it. I'm reading Phenomenology of Spirit, going through it with Half Hour Hegel. Gregory Sadler, shout out. He's actually the one that made me come up with comprehensive studies of these philosophical works that we're doing right now on this YouTube channel. Anyway, so yeah, I'm doing Half Hour Hegel. Shout out to him. I encourage you to do that as well. Whether you want to do that after this or coinciding with this, or click off this now and do that first. That's up to you. But we're doing this now. We're going to make references to Kant, even though we haven't finished Critique of Pure Reason. But that's fine. Whatever we need, I'm sure Patrick and I, who's here, as well as Harrison, we probably know enough to at least get an idea of it. If not, we can always just stop and pull things up and learn on the way. So that's my big inaugural introduction. Maybe you missed some things. Maybe I didn't. I don't know. But hopefully that's enough
Um,
context. Patrick is here, and Harrison, you guys want to say any preliminary remarks?
yeah, I do have couple works of preliminary remarks I'd like to add.
Yeah.
First of all, about the title, Encyclopedia Sciences, right?
Mm.
So this is going to be probably a pretty common misconception for a lot of people, right? When we're talking about sciences, he is not referring to what we would today call science in the English language. The German word is Wissenschaft, but even the word science had a different meaning at the time. If you think about the roots of the English word scientia and Wissenschaft for German is very simple. It's a fusion of knowledge and craft. It's knowledge craft, basically. Um, in English, science, scientia, also comes from knowledge. In both English and German, originally, science meant a comprehensive system of knowledge. And knowledge, almost, I want to say, with a capital K, right? A rigorous sense of knowledge. In the sense that, for instance, they would not consider um, biology dealing with populations, which is primarily a matter of probability and rules of thumbs, as scientific as say mathematics, which is a rigorous system where you can absolutely know, okay, if I do this calculation right, then I know for sure it's going to be this way, right? So science, I hope I've been trying to get to this point here. Science really is about knowledge and the systematic, rigorous pursuit of knowledge in the definition being used by Hegel. It is not what we would think of as natural sciences. In some ways, it's actually opposed to the way, at least I think about natural sciences. Because I think of natural sciences as ultimately probability claims about what is likely to happen in the future based on empirical evidence. And that couldn't be really I mean, it could be further than from what Hegel thinks of as science, but it's very far from what
Yeah,
Hegel thinks of as science.
I did off the bat. I do know that Hegel does touch on maybe not like natural science as we conceive of it today, but just general like philosophies of trying to rigorously understand nature. It'll get brought up in this book a few times, and then the next Encyclopedia Science installment of Encyclopedia Nature, obviously that's going to be all about that. So
Obviously, yeah.
we'll see what Hegel says about
So,
that, but that definitely
yeah,
is an important difference to know off the
right.
bat.
Right. So science here, I guess my general point here is that you should treat science like it's a new word, and the general sense of it is rigorous
Oh, oh,
knowledge. Um, Besides that, I would say, just by way of context, both of us are both me and Matt are roughly at the same point in the phenomenology of spirit, but we're not going through it together. We're going through it separately. And so our understanding of, like our prior understanding of Hegel from outside books, is likely to evolve as we continue with this series and get further in the phenomenology, which will probably inform the way we're interpreting the Encyclopedia Sciences.
yeah, specifically on my end, I'm coming uh, primarily from, well, like I said, I brought up Sadler, so his interpretations I'm bringing in, obviously, like I said earlier, but I also am pretty into Zizek. I'm reading his big metaphysical treatise, Less Than Nothing, Hegel and the Shadow of Dialectical Materialism. So I also have lots of I guess you could say baggage from that. Whether that's positive or negative, we're gonna say I'm gonna try to remain neutral as possible. I'm not gonna be like, oh yes, this like proves Zizek is right about this thing. That would probably be nothing but hurtful for something like this. But that's just maybe something to be like aware of. I also do have some other knowledge. I delved into the science of logic a bit, which is known as the greater logic. It's not this. It's not Encyclopedia Logic. He has a whole extra bigger, more rigorous work, more deep work called the science of logic. I've delved into that as well. In preparation for graduate school, I used it in my writing sample to apply, and I also was just delving into it earlier today, as of the day of this recording, to write a script on Zizek actually, and to go over some Zizekian concepts. So that was a little long-winded, but just to be aware of what like potential biases I may be bringing to the table. Although I'll try to like quell them and be as
Yeah.
neutral as possible. That's where I'm coming from. Yeah, and Patrick said he is also.
Yeah, I also started on the Sadler. I'm a little different in that I got pretty far in the phenomenology before turning to Sadler. So I do have sort of my own interpretation going up to a certain point in the phenomenology. So maybe I differ a little more from Sadler's interpretation. There were certain parts where I looked at it and it's like, I don't think that's what he means there. But most of the time I found him very helpful.
Yeah, I agree. So another shout out to Sadler. I recommend that at least for understanding. Not that you have to take everything that he says as face value, nor should you take everything that we say in this
We say,
study is at this face value. Obviously, as usual in philosophy, do your own critical thinking, and come up with your own things that make the most sense. And hey, if you have your own interpretation that we read in something today or at any point, definitely let us know if you think it'd be helpful. So
anything you'd like to add, Harrison?
yeah,
No,
Harrison
I'm just
is.
I'm ready to get into it.
Yeah, Harrison's
Right,
new to Hegel.
absolutely.
He
Yeah,
just did the first Sadler video. I think you said today or yesterday, right? So,
yeah, I did it.
um,
I did it last night after the yeah
oh, cool. Yeah. So
study.
he just busted into Sadler. Well, actually, that's a weird, silly sounding. He just got into Sadler.
He
So.
just busted into Sadler. All right, well, let's bust into some Hegel.
Yeah, all that
Woo!
preliminary work done. Hopefully you're watching this with 2 times speed, but if not, God bless you and Geist bless you, and let's get into some Hegel. Would anyone like to begin the first paragraph? Which, by the way, we're starting in the introduction. There are a few prefaces that just kind of go over like why he decided to write it, which has a lot to do with his own personal like circumstances at his university and his students, and it didn't seem very relevant to the content of the thing. So I decided to start at just what is labeled introduction. Um, so yeah, that's where we're starting. Just for
I
some.
propose we give Harrison the honor.
All right,
Oh,
Harrison. If you're cool with it, take it away.
If you're comfortable with it.
Section 1.
I didn't want to like volunteer you, but I was thinking, since this is sort of like you put us forward in this way, thought it'd be nice to give you the chance to read
actually,
first.
yeah, I'll start. So,
Cool.
All right.
oh wait, was I picked up?
We're just starting right at the top here.
Oh, okay, wait, yeah. So,
Can you see it?
yeah.
Cool.
All right.
Philosophy lacks the advantage, which the other sciences enjoy, of being able to presuppose its objects, as given immediately by representation. And with regard to its beginning and advance, it cannot presuppose the method of cognition as one that is already accepted. It is true that it does initially have its objects in common with religion. Both of them have the truth in the highest sense of the word as their object, for both hold that God and God alone is the truth. Both of them also go on to deal with the realm of the finite, with nature and the human spirit, and with their relation to each other and to God as to their truth. Hence, philosophy can, of course, presuppose some familiarity with its objects. In fact, it must presuppose this, as well as an interest in these objects. The reason is that in the order of time, consciousness produces representations of objects before it produces concepts of them, and that the thinking spirit only advances to thinking cognition and comprehension by going through representation and by converting itself to it.
All right, that is the inaugural text in Encyclopaedia Logic. This
So
is
much to talk about.
yeah. I forgot he threw in fucking God, which is crazy. And representations and philosophy and presuppositions. So let's break this down and take as much time as we need to with not only this but everything. It's especially important in Hegel, but a good rule of thumb, I'd say, in any philosophy reading. But so it starts out with saying that Hegel wants to start philosophy, at least his philosophy, lacking presupposition about what it's talking about. It doesn't want to make assumptions from the get go. Um, Unlike other sciences, right? Math. Patrick brought some up in the preliminary to just even in his preliminary comments before even reading this, right? Like the biological sciences, the mathematical sciences, although they have varying level of scientific knowledge, like he was saying, they'd still be considered sciences under this definition. But those presuppose its objects is given immediately by representation, right? Uh, um, Biologists don't go, what is this fucking frog? It just goes, there's a frog here. What does it do? Mathematicians, I mean, some, especially, this wasn't really mathematicians after Hegel kind of delved into the foundations of mathematics, but at the time, at least to my understanding, they weren't really doing that. They were just going, oh, okay, here are mathematical entities. Like, what can we do with them? It's more kind of what can we do with these rather than kind of a question of identity. But Hegel doesn't want to do that. Hegel wants to get really foundational and not really presuppose anything. We kind of have to cognize it first.
And that is a great way to read it from sort of a perspective that comes from it from just like I just have very basic background knowledge of philosophy. But what I can see immediately into this is Kantian terminology, right? In this
I
first
was going to get to that when we got to
right?
representations, but if you want to bring that up
Well,
now,
it
sure.
starts with representation, right? He's using this exact wordage here.
Oh, yes, he is.
Being able to presuppose its object as given immediately by representation, right? So if he's using given the way I think he's using given, he's talking about what if you have been in the Kant study, you might know as intuition, right? The idea that certain things are presented for us, right? They exist without our own activity, without our own spontaneity. Instead, they are simply given. They appear before us, right, by representation, given immediately by representation. So in other sciences, the idea here, if I'm interpreting this correctly, which probably, because obviously Hegel is a Kantian in the broad sense. Um, if you talk about other sciences, right, with mathematics, or let's say geometry, right, space is given to us. It's we have space already before us. It is a representation that pre-exists any of our own thinking. If you talk about biology, right, the frog, the appearance of the frog immediately appears before us. We have certain sensory content which we then interpret using our minds, right? Using our power of the understanding, our power of thought. Philosophy here has nothing appears before us.
Yeah.
It has nothing empirical for its content, so to speak. Um, so yeah, I think that's
Or really no
probably
intuition. It's a
works out for what he means.
conceptual science, I guess, if you want to go into that. Getting more into what he says down here. We should also delve into God stuff, but it might be for the sake of explanation and analysis to maybe just jump to what he says down here first. The reason is that in order of time, consciousness produces representation. So this is what you're talking about, right? Well, it's actually maybe this
I think he's
expands.
probably using representations here in a way similar to the way Kant would use intuition.
Yes. Although it's interesting though because this is if we want to get into Kant, this is where we should start to see some of the breakage of Kant's thought. Consciousness produces representations. That is not something consciousness does in
Ah,
Kant. Representations are given to you, and yes, they are given in the sense of like maybe self consciousness. But for Hegel, consciousness expands beyond self consciousness. Consciousness is kind of like the whole system, including like what is given to self-consciousness. That is also part of consciousness. It is much less subjective, much less or much more encompassing than Kant. And so consciousness produces representations because nothing is really given to consciousness as a whole because consciousness is the whole. There's
which
nothing
of
really
course means
outside of consciousness to be given to it.
right. Which of course means that Hegel is already presupposing in his introduction certain of his conclusions. And this is sort of inevitable. He
I mean,
doesn't start.
yes, this is
Yeah, but
sorry, continue.
his like what he's trying to say does not admit of the luxury of starting with what we agree with, right? What is common sense to people, and then working your way up from that to his conclusions. What Hegel's trying to do, he does not believe he can um, justify his system without first explaining it. And in order to explain it, he has to presuppose certain things. And so only when we apprehend the whole can we actually judge the system, is the
Yeah.
way Hegel sees this. So
It's a little wonky, but you'll get used to it.
you just have to, it's simply a matter of supposing for the sake of argument,
Yeah.
at least. Suppose for the sake of argument that consciousness produces representations rather than that representations are given to us.
Yeah.
So he's kind of doing the like. So is he? So is the difference because from what I gather, and I could be again reading Kant wrong, but that it's not that, or I might this might just is it like a thing where the represent because what's because an intuition like a thing is given to us, but when consciousness is given to us, does that mean it's given to us and then something reproduces it, or I guess
Yeah, maybe that's what the imagination is talking about. It's a little bit unclear.
We still don't know
So
what the imagination
right,
exactly is doing.
right. So we've been talking about the imagination, but maybe this is a possible role for this mysterious third thing,
Also, this is
right?
the second
So
time Harrison has come up with a good candidate for imagination. So
yeah,
props to you
exactly.
for that because we couldn't make heads or tails of it. But anyway,
So
sorry.
once
Continue.
again, we're probably inevitably going to reference the Kant study constantly here. Um, so
Cons.
it'd be great if you could be up to date, but if you aren't, which is fine. Um, we don't know, and no one seems to know what the hell Kant is talking about when he talks about intuition. He says basically that there's two faculties. There's sensibility and understanding, right? We take in stuff and then we process them, and then somewhere in the middle he adds this third thing, this third step called imagination, where we in some further way unify the senses and then do the concepts, and no one really knows what it is. But
Maybe people do.
I
We don't,
guess
though. I don't know.
maybe. Well, yeah. Well, people don't agree on what it is what I mean to say,
Oh, okay.
right? Because it's a controversial academic topic.
I don't know. I haven't
Well,
looked into it, but
I get.
I would imagine that is the case.
Well, I
So-
guess.
Well, I want to finish the answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So the answer I was trying to give here is that, yeah, for Kant, he simply says that objects are given to us in or through the sensibility, and we don't know the root of them because knowing the root of them would be outside of ourselves. But he does say that it can't be ourselves, it has to be some kind of thing in itself. So he admits that there is a thing in itself, and it somehow causes us to, in some mysterious way, be given these sensibilities. And then maybe the imagination is the thing that like reproduces it in ourselves. Not clear. Not
Yeah.
clear.
Well,
For Kant, for Hegel, no thing in itself. There's not this thing in itself and
Unknowable thing in itself.
right. There's not this
Things
unknowable,
are in
absolutely
themselves in
distinct thing in
Hegel.
itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is like a certain thing in itself, right, which is being in itself and being for itself. But both of those are moments which constantly are in dialectic and like sublate each other.
Yeah, but in itself certainly does at least show itself in the system as opposed to Kant where you can't even like touch it at all.
Right.
So yeah.
So yeah,
Harrison,
did
do
that
you
answer
have
the question?
I guess.
you sound
That
more
is to say,
uncertain.
it's rather mysterious how representations appear to us in Kant.
I guess. Well, because I guess it's from what I gather, it's like, do either of them seek to say? I guess what I was like, do either of them claim? Because they claim to actually know how to say anything about how they appear to us, or because from what I
Yes,
gather,
Hegel
the idea
will
is
go
Yeah,
just that.
Hegel will.
extensively into that.
Because from
Basically, Kant doesn't and Hegel does.
Hegel
I
does
mean, Kant-
extensively. Yes. This is
from
a
what I
criticism
gather,
Hegel has of Kant. Hegel says Kant, because of the way he set up his system, Kant can't touch on this thing which is essential for understanding like consciousness. And that's basically Hegel's critique. And Hegel thus will go very much into his theory about how he thinks consciousness
I mean,
produces representations before us.
yeah, I mean, more than saying that Hegel does. I mean, you might even say that that's all Hegel does.
well, could you? Well, what about the? I guess you'd say, is there
Yes.
that that receiving is producing, that like you receive the information and then like you produce an experience, like you like there like it isn't like, I guess. I could be doing the thing, and I have a bad habit of this where I take my um light knowledge of natural sciences or sciences in regards to like psychology and neuroscience, and I conflate them with being equivalent to philosophical arguments, which is not necessarily true. And so I think I might be confusing myself there as well.
Um,
So what's the question? Is there a
I don't know if
question?
I think I guess.
I mean, it is easy to do such a thing because these terms and concepts are often used like in the same language, at least, as like sciences, like representations, especially when you get things like to perception. Like these are also
Yeah.
things that like empirical sciences do try to account for.
Yes,
Usually
and I
philosophy
guess.
and those things are talking about them in different ways, but they're still like touching on the same subject matter, at least broadly. So it makes sense
Yeah.
to like kind of want to conflate one with the other.
Yeah, and well, I guess this is my thing, and I think I might be, and this is the thing. I think I do find I need to continually remind myself on the difference. But what would say, as far as when like neuroscience is talking about, oh, we receive information and then the brain, in quotes, like produces it. What do we, when we're talking about like the mind producing, like what is the difference between those two things? Is there any relation at all, or are they completely disconnected?
Well, the neuroscience is usually dealing with a more empirical, like framework. pretty much an entirely empirical framework, at least in the issues of neuroscience that I've understood, unless they're specifically dealing with like the philosophical like hard problem of consciousness, for example. But if you're dealing with a
yeah,
purely neuroscientific concept, then usually what is meant by like reception is some sort of like empirical like matter based input, like material input is mainly it's
yeah,
dealing with material input and how that is materially processed in the brain to give like you an experience that is like also
yes,
material. It's
Oh,
basically just
I
materialized.
yeah,
And usually what we're talking about in
yeah,
philosophy and especially in theoretical works like this is metaphysics. So we're
so
talking
I
yeah.
about oh sorry, what's up,
I
Pat?
guess for me, I've always kind of, I guess just
well,
before,
I would like to answer the question in Kant first, and then maybe try in Hegel. So
yeah,
in Kant, right? Take an example. Let's take a concrete example. Um, Neuroscience says when I eat some hot sauce, the spicy, like the capsaicin, activates on my taste buds, and there's a nervous response, and then the nervous response gets sent to my brain, and then my brain produces the representation, right?
yes,
And so it's not given to us; it is an active process of the brain, which seems to
yeah,
contradict Kant. Okay, the reason this does not contradict Kant is because Kant does not say we are the brain, right? For Kant, Kant is dealing with consciousness as it presents itself to itself, basically.
Basically like qualia is how I would think of it. Qualia versus like the actual material processes that like seem to
Because
get connected
yeah.
to qualia
So
experiences.
regardless of what your brain does, are you aware of like the neurochemical processes that actually produce the capsaicin, or like the, or not the capsaicin, that turns capsaicin gradually into the sensation of spiciness, or does the spiciness simply appear before you?
hmm. It
Right?
does
I,
simply
I
appear.
yeah, I am not aware of all these neuroscientific processes. They are external to my consciousness, even though they are internal to my physical body. But for Kant, we are examining consciousness, not the physical body. So Kant would not, he would certainly not assume identity with the body,
Which
right?
is
And I
which
think even if
is
you
a
rem-
philosophical position that some try to uphold, but it's definitely not the ones that we're dealing with here.
yes, but even so, identity with the body, you'd have to be very naive to say I'm identical with my entire body. Like the me of consciousness is identical with my entire body. Okay, so
Well, to
what
say,
if my hand gets cut off? Does my consciousness get split in half?
I
No,
mean, yeah, no,
clearly not.
it's not a very
is there?
well respected position, but it is a position. I just figured I'd
Well,
throw it out
most
there
Well,
in
most
case.
positions simply say that a certain part of ourselves, like if we take identity theory, the mind is identical with the brain.
is there a difference between saying that I identify with my brain, or that I simply emerge from my brain?
Yeah, there's definitely a difference between the two.
Those are two
But
different positions.
I think the
I guess
broad
then,
point here is that you've got to understand we're talking about what presents itself to consciousness, what presents itself to experience, and
yeah,
ultimately a lot of things that are like internal, scientifically speaking, to the organism of you, right? The organism that we designate Harrison, member of the species Homo sapiens,
yeah,
is not the same as your consciousness,
I
right?
see. I guess my thing is, and I wonder, can these fields cross pollinate in a
In what
sense?
sense?
In the sense of like, if I, because there are like things that neuroscience from the other does tell us that do like line up and check out with things that also Kant says, and that like that like we
Um,
to
well,
to an extent,
So, certain times, I
and I
think
guess like what,
philosophically, um, philosophers hit on some kind of point that's pretty necessarily true, and
yes,
we make genuine progress in philosophy and kind
yeah,
of don't look back. And if hard science, confirms that, it's simply because, yeah, of course, hard science confirms that it couldn't be otherwise, right? Because it's a more fundamental rule than hard science. So that's sort of like someone invents a geometrical law, and then we find in physics that it's true. Well, of course it's true. Geometry is prior to physics. right? Philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, all of these are prior to natural science. So if we actually get an actual valid conclusion in philosophy that's 100% like we know this is true, then of course it's going to be constantly confirmed, or it couldn't be contradicted and could be confirmed by natural science.
Yes, I think.
But I don't think that really is natural science adding anything to philosophy.
Natural science can inspire like philosophical questions, like
That's definitely true.
for example, like the ontology of quantum physics, Zizek finds very interesting, and he uses that to like he uses the language of quantum physics to because there's a kind of like incompleteness found in the universe, in quantum physics, and there's some like terms related to that Zizek finds helpful to draw analogies to and to like even explore his own like position of ontological incompleteness. Even though ontology and quantum physics are different fields, there are like concepts that like evoke similar language, and like I guess they're just similar concepts on different levels. So like one can inspire the other, and can even like help us communicate better. But that's like about the extent I think to which those can do that. Like in terms of science is inspiring philosophy, not the other way around.
All right, guys. What do you say we move on to the second sentence?
Yes.
Okay.
So,
And with
yeah.
regard to its beginning and advance, it cannot presuppose the method of cognition as one that is already accepted. It cannot
Right.
presuppose the method.
I think this one's actually pretty straightforward. Actually,
Yeah, I was gonna say it doesn't seem that deep. It's just basically saying you can't presuppose the way things work. Also, cognition, as far as what I understand from Hegel, doesn't necessarily mean subjective cognition either. It has to do with the similar thing like consciousness. It's more like encompassing. It involves both objective and subjective aspects. So there's objective and subjective cognition. I think anyway, from what I've seen in Hegel and how he uses these words. Um, but regardless of whether you're talking about objective cognition or subjective cognition, because cognition is basically thought, and thought is encompassing both objective and subjective aspects of consciousness. Um, you can't really presuppose how it works, right? The method, the way by which it works. You shouldn't come into philosophy assuming that it works how assuming it works a certain way, which actually, to go back to Harrison's question about like the difference between like philosophy and neuroscience and why it is so different from other things, these two things, I guess, these two sentences kind of give one good answer to that, in that he's saying that, right, other sciences enjoy being able to presuppose objects and presuppose the method. They have certain methods that they just strictly assume, and philosophy can't do that. We have to take a step back and say, well, why is this the case? Why are things working like this? Let's not go with a certain one we've picked out or one we like. We have to really investigate it from the beginning. We can't presuppose. So that seems pretty straightforward to me. I don't know if there's another interpretation or another.
Agreed.
What's
Let's
that?
keep going.
Okay. And then so this is where things get meaty in terms of content.
So it's true that it does initially have its objects in common with religion. Both of them have truth in the highest sense of the word as their object, for both hold that God and God alone is the truth. Right.
So this is something that maybe will ring a lot of bells for a lot of people, especially the claim that God, the philosophy's core tenet is that God alone is the truth. This may be very misleading, and I'm gonna let Patrick take this explanation because you probably be able to, especially with your like Spinoza experience and knowing that Hegel and Spinoza are alike a lot, especially in the God aspect. I'm gonna let you.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, obviously this is a controversial claim, but if you are a theist in anything resembling a classical sense, and that's so broad that it includes Spinozism, which is pretty far from the typical conception of classical theism. But if you're a theist in almost any sense, it's definitely true that you believe philosophy is the object of philosophy is God, right? Because if you believe in God, generally you believe that God is literally identical with truth, right? That God is the same as the truth. And so if philosophy is the love of wisdom, the love of truth, right? All these things are themselves God. If metaphysics is the study of being, and being qua being, being in itself, being as being, what is being as being? It's God, right? Aristotle himself answers this.
Yes, Hegel's very Aristotelian as well. So that this is
Exactly. So
more
this is it's a
representative.
very Aristotelian statement.
Yes.
And so although this is certainly a controversial statement in the sense that Russell would not accept it, it's not original and it's not terribly, out there for his time, right?
Yeah, exactly. For his
Saying
time, I just
that
wanted to
both
make sure
hope
that
in God and
context was
God
clear.
alone.
We don't mean like the anthropomorphic, like, God. I mean, he does think it's the
Oh
God of.
yeah. Yeah,
I
I'm
do want to say he does end up thinking it is the God of Christianity, but he interprets the God of Christianity in
not
his
out here.
own way that is not like I guess canonical maybe is a good way to put it, but it isn't really like, it's not the traditional religious conception. So 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 please take that more in the Aristotelian Spinoza, uh, maybe Aquinas, maybe Thomistic way, but I don't even want to say that because that also has some.
Well, I mean, Thomistic I mean, how can you get more traditional than Thomistic in terms of your conception of God, right?
Yeah, but that's
Yeah.
where Hegel
So,
breaks from. So I don't want to like.
well, okay, so what I want to talk about broadly here is the first thing is honestly, this is just a guide for any serious philosophy. You have to lay aside the man in the sky stuff. There's no
Yes, please.
philosopher that's going to be like, "Ah, yes, the man in the sky." And not only that, like if you turn to practical religion, the Catholic Church, it's heresy to say that God has a body. It's heresy to say that God can be literally angry, right? For instance,
Yeah.
God is not subject to human passions in that sense, right? So, um, what was I saying? Yeah, you have to leave the anthropomorphizing at the gate and understand that Hegel has not specified what God means to him yet. It's
Yes.
going
Keep
to
it open.
be right. It's going to be what we call the absolute, right? The highest truth, the unconditioned, right?
Again,
Um,
very Aristotelian stuff. Um,
all that kind of
the
stuff. But
self-thinking thought.
its nature as personal or impersonal or both or some weird combination and what specific qualities it has, well, that hasn't been decided yet because that is the task of philosophy in Hegel's view, right? So don't come into this word God with a lot of preconceptions.
Yes,
One thing
that's
that you
a big
can
thing.
have a preconception of, though, is what he's already said, which is that God alone is the truth, right? So he is saying
In
that
a
God
very
is
literal
identical to truth.
sense. Yes.
Yeah, God alone is the truth. He's already said that, except that that is what he's saying. So the one thing we know about God so far in Hegel is that God is the truth.
Hmm. Um,
um, but
and
yes, it's definitely, from what I understand, a conception highly influenced by Spinoza and Aristotle in terms of God, but also highly original in certain ways.
yes, which we will definitely get to as well. Especially, I'm hoping we make it to Encyclopedia, Geist, Encyclopedia Spirit, Mind, whatever. But that is very filled with this concept as well. So,
But
um,
one other thing I would probably like to bring up,
mhm.
I feel like in sort of pop discussions of Hegel, maybe even in academic discussions, but I'm not as familiar, but in pop broad discussions of Hegel, they really like to treat him like he's secular for some reason. They just focus
Yeah,
on the historical aspect and ignore the part where, like, by the way, what is this historical aspect oriented towards? Oh yeah, the whole thing is his theism. The
yeah.
whole thing is this philosophy of the absolute, which is to say God, right? And so they like to treat him like this secular philosopher of history almost, and it's just not. It's not like a misconception. It's just that people very much represent this historical aspect of Hegel and ignore the fact that basically he is a philosophical theologian.
Yeah, yeah. Theology definitely comes. Hey, I mean, this isn't even a controversial thing for this. This is literally what he's saying. He's saying that God, he's basically tying religion and philosophy together in very like in a fundamental way. So that's not. I was gonna say, religion almost comes first in Hegel. The
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's not controversial, but it's an underappreciated fact,
yes,
I would say,
and let's keep that in mind as we
that Hegel is a highly theological thinker.
yes. Um, right then. So tying this to the greater paragraph, then both religion and philosophy share the object of God. Um, both of them also go on to deal with the realm of the finite, with nature, the human spirit, and their relation to each other and to God as their truth. So yes, philosophy doesn't only and religion don't only deal with God; they also deal with these other subjects, how they relate to each other, and how these things relate to God, as the truth being God. So how do and that, honestly, that's what makes it very very compelling, and I think
And
for
this is a really interesting way of phrasing this too. And to God as their truth, their relation to each other,
hmm.
and to God as their
Yeah,
truth,
that's kind of what
right?
I said. Is because
So
God
yeah,
alone is the truth. So
so that
the
means that
truth
the
of these
truth of the
things
object,
is
right?
God. Yep.
The truth of the object, or in other words, the object truly conceptualized, is only something in relation to God,
Yep.
right? Only a certain way or moment of conceiving of God, perhaps. Um, but that is to say, generally, that like you can only comprehend the true nature of any given thing through comprehending God, because it's only in relation to God that they exist.
Hmm. Um, and then we kind of move on to the last point of this paragraph. So he says, of course, we have familiarity with the objects. It's necessary. You can't really, uh, you can't really have like thoughts without some sort of content. So you have to have some sort of content, and uh, so they're there. But this is an interesting thing to grasp about Hegel and found in this sentence here. The reason is that in order of time, conscious produces representation of objects before it produces concepts of them. So this is a very important. And this is where I was originally gonna connect it to Kant, but we've already done a lot of that now. So hopefully you can see that. But the thing I want to focus on here now that we brought up Kant is the order of time consciousness produces representation. So there's kind of like an order here: representations and then concepts that are bound by time. Time is an essential concept in Hegel. Hegel is what is known as a dynamic thinker. He thinks in terms of like movement and progression and succession. So this isn't just for like this initial thing. The time and consciousness time as like maybe a hyphenated term is going to be maybe something that you want to just kind of keep in the back of your mind, or honestly at the forefront as we go through this. But specifically how it relates to what he's been talking about here, representations come before concepts in consciousness. We get things and then we conceptualize them. This is kind of what, even though I drew this difference earlier, conscious produces representations. That's different from Kant. We've covered that already, so I'm not going to go through that again. But uh, this is something that is shared with Kant, that representations come before concepts, right? We take in something and then we cognize it and then conceptualize it. That is basically what the critical project showed. And like Patrick said earlier, Hegel is a Kantian in at least a broad general sense, and he's really showing that here, even though he differed with it, what this word produces, this general notion of representations preceding concepts, that's being kept from Kant. And then he says the thinking spirit only advances to thinking, cognition, and comprehension by going through representation and by converting itself to it. Hmm.
Says what the it and the to it means here, right? Does the thinking spirit uh, convert the thinking spirit to representations, or does it convert the representations to the thinking spirit?
Can you like maybe like mess with your mic or something? It's a little hard to hear you.
Uh, Sorry, is this better?
Oh yes, much better. Sorry, repeat that.
So does the thinking spirit convert representations to itself, or does the thinking spirit convert itself to the representations?
Um, so
I guess the latter.
I'm gonna cheat and say it's the same thing because I kind of know that in Hegel. Well, it doesn't say the same, right? It goes through a dialectical progression as it gets conceptualized, but ultimately it returns back into the representations, um, and and the representations kind of are of what he calls actualized form of thinking spirit. So thinking spirit for Hegel is formal. It's kind of basically like Kant. It's concepts versus intuitions, but they're not so different as they are in Kant. They're different forms of the same thing. So they convert themselves into it and back as well. If I'm not mistaken, it's kind of like a two-way thing, a two-way street. Um,
All right. I have no further remarks on that paragraph at this time. I
no,
think
we did it. We did a paragraph.
we did a paragraph. I mean, Harrison, do you have any questions?
Yeah, please ask.
So this is okay. This is my thing. I think, and okay. So I have had a mild. I wouldn't call it existential crisis. I'd say an agonizing reappraisal of my understanding, and that is that I think so. Immediately, I think, and this is again, I can't tell in this whether or not what's happening is that at one point I understood, but right now, upon reflecting, I just am running into this problem where I repeatedly conflate scientific and natural science principles with philosophical ones, as though they are equivalent. But for some reason, I got very uncomfortable at the prospect that the mind can accurately um, judge or reflect the cause of itself.
So here's the thing I immediately want to start you with, or start the answer with, is that I think your question is a little flawed in the sense that this is not like just self consciousness. Like thinking spirit is both subjective and objective. Like this is the idealism of Hegel. The absolute idealism is that the entire actuality, like entire reality, is thinking in the sense that it's like intelligible, and so like it's not just uh like the mind, like obviously the mind can produce error about the like objective world, like the obviously like subjective consciousness can make errors about objective consciousness, and in fact this happens all the time,
Which,
and
well,
it is the basis for like Hegel's opening of phenomenology of spirit sense certainty. That's kind of like what is actually going on there, right? The subjective consciousness is is confused about the objective consciousness. So that's
And
actually like
this,
the basis for a lot of his philosophy. But
and then
but this is a major point on which I want to really question Hegel, because
okay.
he sort of takes it implicitly. He implicitly assumes and just moves with the idea that we can, in the same breath, with the same like conversation, talk about subjective experience and some kind of objective experience as if they are the same, and just a general like spirit
yeah,
itself. And so, can you actually do that? Maybe he will justify that in the future, but that is another thing that he has to justify. And furthermore, it's one that didn't already seem justified to me, as opposed to like the idea that God alone is the truth. That already seemed justified to me as a Spinozist, right?
well, yeah,
But this idea that we can talk about human spirit as some sort of universal entity, right? Some sort of, is it an abstract universal? No, I think he thinks it's a concrete universal. Um, it's weird, it's ambiguous, it has to be proved through the system if it's going to be proved at all, and we have
yeah,
to accept this idea that there's like a somehow universal spirit of humanity, so to speak, that is
yeah.
subjective and objective.
I think for me, another thing that initially, and that just kind of had me like, I think frozen for like I was just like thinking and writing down, and I'm definitely like as I'm saying this, I'm not. This is not me saying at all that I don't want to continue the reading. I do, but I think I very much need to like kind of like I think analyze and this bring up some of my assumptions that I think I'm having, and one of those being I think you mentioned Patrick, that philosophy um, is is prior to, say, natural science, and I guess I would agree with that in regards to like the fact that thought, or like if philosophy is just thought or understanding through understanding, then that like by doing science you inevitably, like, or doing anything, you are engaging some kind of philosophy, some kind of amount of thought in which is necessary to do the thing in the first place. But I guess my issue in regards to like saying that the thing that we gain from the neuroscience is or that the philosophy presupposes that knowledge is my thing, is that I guess I'm coming at it with that I'm not sure that that by simply understanding ourselves through our faculty of understanding, that we can actually get to like knowledge per se, because of the fact of that, like how do we verify what um like if we're pointing at like a mental object of, oh, I have this faculty, how do we know that that is not simply a mental error? I guess it is just kind of Cartesian demon at
Oh
that
no,
point.
I wouldn't assume away skepticism. You got to take skepticism seriously.
Yeah,
However,
which
even if skepticism were true, it would still be prior to natural science, right? It's when I say philosophy is prior to natural science, I'm saying if and only if something turns out to be demonstrably, rigorously, scientifically, provably, philosophically true, right? Then that would be prior to natural science. I'm not saying any such conclusion actually exists.
yes, yeah, yeah,
so
yeah.
so
Okay,
it's
that
not
you
meant to
scared me. You scared
discard
me.
the
Yeah,
skeptic. It's not meant to discard the skeptical challenge. It's
yeah,
meant to say, um, if Kant is right, right on his own thing, then he doesn't need the confirmation of science. Right? He
yes,
doesn't gain anything from the confirmation of
yeah.
science, but we would
I,
expect the confirmation of science.
yes, and I think I think the reason I brought it, and I don't, and I wonder if I guess just my question is, or hope is to figure out whether or not to how to alter my thinking in this way, because for me, I think I definitely see it as like is me thinking of science like saying that, well, just because for me one thing, like science, well, I know like there's a standard thing like, oh, science is philosophy, but also just like by doing science you are, well, I guess it's like, is should I, like, if I want to like start taking these works seriously and understanding them as the way they're meant to be written, do I need to just separate natural science completely from what I'm reading?
I'm not sure that you should separate it completely because Hegel references natural science. Um,
But you should separate it in terms of like level of foundation. Like I would pretty much, yeah, 100% say yes.
yeah,
You shouldn't like conflate these on the same level because um and Hegel is, this is the whole point of his, at least the first two sentences of this, is to kind of get you in that mindset. It's to say philosophy is different. We're not presupposing objects given by representation. We're not presupposing method. And
here,
neuroscience and well, I don't know if you actually brought up other sciences, but like any science that you could, any other science you could think of, will presuppose these things, and so that's why they're fundamentally different, and we're doing something totally different than what they're doing. There will be crossover, and like Patrick said, there will be reference, but you have to. The whole point of these two sentences is to answer your question. Basically, yes, we need to separate them and realize they are distinct things, and that we're doing something totally original and unique in philosophy. Um, Now, if you want to like challenge that and be some like identity theorist or like materialist or something of that sort, or emergent theorist, you can go ahead and do that. But at least for in terms of for reading and understanding, yes, you should separate them. Uh,
Okay.
and I have a certain philosophy of science, which I assume I think Matt mostly shares this philosophy of science. For me, science is a predictor of future experiences, right? And all of that is contained within the nexus of possible experience. And so philosophy here, phenomenology here, is dealing with the nature of possible experience as such, right? And so if we talk about neuroscience, for me, I don't take that as actually explaining consciousness or intended to explain consciousness. I take that as intended to explain the activity of the brain as an objective phenomenon, which is observable. That's not
Yes.
the same as consciousness. The only way
Of
we can
course.
observe consciousness is through our own subjectivity.
At least subjective consciousness.
Right, sure. The only way,
Neuroscience is what Hegel would say is an instance of uh, objective consciousness, right? It's just taking objects as they are in themselves.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure where that fits in Hegel's schema.
I'm
I
pretty sure,
definitely.
from what I know from Hegel and from what I've read, that seems to be the case. We'll see for sure, but
But I would interpret neuroscience as the science of basically brain activity and neural activity. And brain and neural activity are useful because they predict behavior,
Yes.
not consciousness.
Yes. I
That's
guess
the way I take it.
the only thing I would say that, and I don't know if this actually helps my case or not, but is that I do agree that most neuroscience does a really bad job at answering like the hard question. Um, there was and I actually no, I'm going to save this for after the thing because this is a whole long-winded thing. But basically to do with the separating experience from measured behavior, and that we can do that by, I guess. Hmm, Actually, no. I'm gonna talk about this later. You can cut this out. I'm gonna talk about this later because that's a
yeah,
whole
I mean, it
thing.
sounds
But
like what you're talking about is basically the problem of behaviorism, and yeah, that is going
well,
pretty
well,
far
well,
fetched
well
from the
I
content
guess
of this. So,
yeah. I guess I'm not a behaviorist, although
no, I'm not
I
saying you
guess
are, but that sounds like
yeah.
that sounds like the
I don't.
problem that behaviorists were trying to deal with. So, well, we can get
Yeah,
into that because that's pretty far fetched from
yeah.
what we're talking about
I,
here.
I guess then I don't know if this is how most Hegel philosophers think, but I guess my whole philosophy of science is very much a unity between the two, in which they both must necessarily combine. This which I don't know if that
So
if
yeah,
like
in Hegel's philosophy, natural science has its place in consciousness as like a valid, like legitimate, like thing, as its own
yeah,
like natural science. But again, it has its place. It's not supposed to be at the same level as philosophy. Philosophy is its own thing. That's just what he starts out with
okay,
the gate saying. It's its own thing. You can't conflate it with any other thing, and it's the reason you can't is because it lacks presuppositions about objects and method. The only thing it has is familiarity with objects, but it's not making conceptual assumptions about them. We're going to be investigating actually like this process of doing that in general. So that's something very
okay,
different from what any other science is doing.
okay,
Other sciences may claim to do this, but I would argue that anyone that does is failing to recognize its own presuppositions, and once it does, it stops making sense. uh,
I guess then before we move on,
yeah.
the only thing I would say is that I think that the claim that a science is attempting to do this alone, I think that is correct in saying that's wrong. To say that and that through use of, I guess by necessarily including philosophy in its models, I guess like you could say that they're, I don't know. I think I might be running into some
I
kind
think
of
this may be an
cognitive.
extended debate on the philosophy of science for another day.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Generally, what
I
you
think
have
I
to know as your question relates to it is the answer I gave is basically found in these first two sentences. That's what I'm going to go to just relate it to what Hegel has said
okay.
so far, and the
I'll
rest we can save
yeah, we're good.
for later.
Yeah.
Um, cool. So that's overall, that's the first paragraph. Let's analyze the second paragraph here. But when we
Well,
can
we
get.
haven't read it yet.
Oh, we haven't.
So yeah,
Oh, we haven't read
no.
it. I'm sorry. I thought we. No, you're right. Patrick, do you want to read this?
Yes, I will be happy to.
Thank you.
But when we consider something in thought, we soon become aware that thoughtful consideration implies the requirement that the necessity of its content should be shown, and the very being, as well as the determinations of its objects, should be proved. As a result, the familiarity with these objects that was mentioned above is seen to be insufficient, and making or granting the validity of presuppositions and assurances is seen to be inadmissible. The difficulty of making a beginning arises immediately because a beginning, being something immediate, does make a presupposition, or rather, it is itself just that. So this is, in my view, a lot simpler. I think we can actually dispose of this in 20 minutes.
Yeah. Let's do it. I agree. There's much less here. This is all kind of one thing versus like, oh, this is what philosophy
There's
is. This is what
definitely,
God
first
is.
of all, just like a very broad point here, which is simply that the difference between philosophy and religion is that religion assumes a bunch of shit, and philosophy says, no, you have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, beyond any possible doubt, and determine it completely, explain the whole thing. So, yes, I mean, that's actually basically the whole summary of the paragraph.
Yeah, I do want to just.
There are a couple things we could get more gritty about, though.
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking about doing that with is here. I know Kierkegaard specifically has a his basically criticism of Hegel's philosophy is that, oh, well, he claims to be presuppositionless, but that's literally impossible. And he kind of addresses that in this paragraph, so I find that interesting. I don't want to say he like solves it, but at least he acknowledges it, and maybe he will go on to further address it in section 2. But
no, I don't think he is claiming here to be presuppositionless. I think he's claiming rather that the necessity needs to be shown, right? But that it involves making presuppositions which are
that
at
are
the same time
necessary.
inadmissible. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're inadmissible and yet they're necessary.
Yeah, so I guess he's kind of answering it in that sense. Not let's be presuppositionless, but let's be like let us
Let's
start
admit
from a
that
necessary beginning.
let's take some presuppositions, even though they're admissible, inadmissible, right? I
What is
think inadmissible meaning not valid, meaning we can't do this. It wouldn't be so. For instance, we've been having this whole discussion about the nature of science. Well, one thing I would say about the nature of science is because of its nature as observing the outside world, any claim it makes about the nature of consciousness itself, for instance, the claim of what happens to consciousness after death, say, I would call that inadmissible. Any claim that science makes is inadmissible. That's the meaning of the word here, right? It's not, in a sense, legal according to the method, according to the logic of whatever field we're dealing with. And in the case of philosophy, he's basically saying that like it would be bad philosophy. It would not be acceptable philosophy to make these presuppositions and to make these assurances. And yet, he says we have to do it anyway. And so, basically, he acknowledges that the philosophy he's establishing is flawed at the outset because only in its completeness can the flaws be redeemed.
Yeah. So that's
Right.
kind of
So
the
he's
answer
not.
to the Kierkegaardian criticism.
Yeah. So he's not presuppositionless. It's that the presuppositions need to be negated because they are inadmissible.
Yeah, but we still need to begin somewhere. But it's just difficult because because a beginning does make a presupposition, or rather is itself just that. So you need to start with the presupposition. A beginning is a presupposition. And it's inadmissible, but consciousness, as we saw earlier, will conceptualize it, and that involves negating in Hegel. So, yeah, that actually didn't take 20 minutes. I don't think there was anything else I really wanted to say.
No, I was just overestimating. Yeah,
that took like 3 minutes. Cool.
Yeah, it was like, I mean, honestly, that was probably the most straightforward paragraph of Hegel I ever read.
Yeah, that's what I mean. This is much more clean than phenomenology. If clean is a good word to use, but Yeah. So that's section 1. How long have we been going? We've been going for just over an hour. I'm not sure if starting section 2, at least since I'm recording, would be wise. Maybe we should let this sit.
I agree.
Especially if there's newcomers to Hegel here. This is a lot. So I think this is all we'll give you to chew in this recording. So
Yep.
unless there are any other questions or remarks from Harrison or Patrick, we can probably get going here. Anything, guys,
No.
or no? Cool. Okay. Well, thank you for joining us for the inaugural
Two
comprehensive yet
paragraphs.
informal. The inaugural which consists of 2 paragraphs. It's the inaugural comprehensive yet informal study of Encyclopaedia Sciences, which starts, of course, with the logic, and that's what we're starting with, because everything needs a beginning, but that's a presupposition. So let's investigate it and conceptualize further, not only now, but also as when we move on to section 2 and ad infinitum. So, yay! Thank you for joining
Yay.
us. Yippee! We started Hegel study. That's crazy. That's cool. Thank you, Harrison, for starting this, or inspiring us to start this. Maybe is a more accurate term, but this is cool. Hopefully, everyone's enjoying Hegel. Maybe not enjoying yet. This is a lot of new stuff. Maybe you're weirded out. That's okay.
I mean, I'm enjoying Hegel.
I mean, me too. But we've had background, so. Hegel freaked me out a little bit when I first was presented with this work in undergrad. So,
Wie cool ist das bitte?
yeah, don't worry.
Cola
It
und
gets better.
Fortnite.
Read this. Read that it deals with the finite and the nature of the human nature and human spirit and God, and hopefully that'll excite you and motivate you to keep going, if nothing else does. Or its connections to Kant. That should also be a good motivator if you know Kant and like Kant.
Read
Yeah.
it because you're a Marxist and you want to understand Marx.
Yeah. If you're like
I
a
mean, it's
plastic
legitimate,
pills
but
audience.
at the same time, I feel like it'll give you a bad time.
Yeah,
Because if you read it because you're like already a Marxist and you're like, religion is the opiate of the masses, and then you have to read all this whole thing about like this elaborate theology,
yeah,
you might get a little ticked off.
yeah. It also is a while till he goes into like politics in depth. I'm not even sure it's something he does. And I know he like make reference to politics, but I don't know if there's anything beyond that. You might have to wait till philosophy of right to get there, which I don't know if we'll do a study of. Uh, if we did, that would probably be very far ahead. So, yeah, rip Marxists, but maybe you'll come along anyway. Who knows? We hope you do. Yeah, that's been the first one. Join us next time for section 2. Yippee! Good night,
Yippee.
America. Good night, YouTube.
Ist das bitte?